So as I said last week, this is it's Unification Thought. It's looking at the first chapter is called Theory of the Original Image. It's trying to present some kind of idea, conception of what God is like, and because then everything else, then in terms of philosophy, then flows from the conception of what God is like. So we looked at last week this idea that God had dual aspects of inner character, external form, or Sung Sang, Hyung Sang, that's said in Korean. Not that the Korean has any particular depth or meaning to it, because this idea is much more investigated and looked at within the Greek philosophical tradition. Anyway, so I had this idea that everything has these two different aspects: an inner aspect which is invisible and subject, and an outer aspect which is visible and object. By subject and object, I mean our mind is invisible. That's our mind which tells our body to move around, to do things. But it's invisible. It does that. Okay, so the other attributes of God are these ideas of yin and yang, or yang and yin. These are indirect or secondary attributes. So the primary attributes are internal and external. So every being then has an inner and outer aspect. So these secondary ones, the yang and yin, they're indirect or secondary attributes. So God's Sung Sang has a yin and yang. God's Hyung Sang is also yin and yang. So it's a way of modifying something. So in that sense, it's secondary. So I mean, if you imagine a lump of clay, you can mold it. You can stick your thumb into it, and you've got a concave bit. And then also you've got a convex bit. But you can't have concave and convex by themselves. Do you know what I mean? Yes? Can you imagine a concave and convex without it being a concave or convex something?
No.
You know, it was a bit like Alice in Wonderland was through the looking glass. You remember the cat with his smile? Kept fading away until all that's left was a smile. Is it possible to have a smile without something on which there is the smile?
No.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in that sense, you can't have the smile without the cat, without the mouth that's smiling. So the cat's mouth can either be a smile or it can look like this, be unhappy, or it could be smiling, but you can't have a smile without something that is smiling. You know what I mean? So in that sense, it's secondary. You can't have a smile without the cat. That's what the point C.S. Lewis is trying to make. It's a secondary attribute. So you can't have masculine by it. You can't have masculine by itself. It has to be masculine something, or feminine something. Yes. So fundamentally, we're human beings. We have a mind and body, and then our physical body is then modified. It either comes out male or comes out female. And then also the mind generally has tendency towards a more feminine aspect or masculine aspect. Make sense? So that's what it means by
saying male and female is contingent on there being an internal and external?
What?
It's saying it's like saying that something's contingent.
Yes.
Male and female is contingent on there being an internal and external.
Well, it's contingent on there being something to be male or female, yes.
But internal and external doesn't need male and female for its own existence.
No. Well, it doesn't, in that sense, Sung Sang and Hyung Sang, the substance, they actually exist. Yin and Yang don't exist. They're just modifications of the substance.
Yeah. Okay.
And that makes sense?
Yeah.
So it's a different category. No? Okay. Anyway, within God, everything is united into oneness. And only these things only become differentiated when you get the creation. So it's not the same as Taoism. Okay, so the idea of yin and yang in Taoism is that yang is sun. Examples of yang will be the sun and the moon. So these are actually substantial things, or a mountain and a valley, or hard and soft day and night. So it's a different kind of. Whereas in the principle, then yin and yang are modifications of Sung Sang, Hyung Sang. Whereas in Oriental philosophy, they can be substantial in their own right in that sense. That makes sense? So if you look at, this is Taoism here, you get heaven and earth, spring and autumn, summer and winter. So it's a different kind of conception of yin and yang than what the principle is talking about. Big states, small states. Make sense? There's a different way of looking at these things.
Is there any crossover with dualism?
Sorry? Well, I mean, yin and yang is, okay, I'll come on to that in a moment. Anyway, the thing that they have in common is that yin and yang are complementary. They attract each other. They're different sides of the same coin in that sense. But also, you can see here, if you look at this as a sort of Taoist view, you can see there's a mixture of different things going on here. And so you've got soldiers and labourers, these are two different types of beings. But also you've got something like, action and inaction. There's obviously an active person or an inactive person. So sometimes these are primary and sometimes they're secondary. Does that make sense? Yeah, am I making sense here? So in that sense, it's not as clear, because here you've got a mixture of categories. The way that yin and yang function in Taoism, you have a mixture of categories. Some of these things are sort of different entities, and sometimes they're just different aspects of the same entity.
They don't have male and female as characteristic?
Well, they're there, aren't they? Man and woman.
Yeah.
Okay.
While the action and inaction you would say are real.
You can have a man and a woman, two separate entities, but you can't have an action and an inaction without something that has been active or inactive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in that sense, there are lots of different things mixed up here.
Sure.
It's different. But again, it's not classical dualism because you don't have good and evil here, and they are attractive towards each other. There's lots of different kinds of relationships that are going on here. Controlling others, being controlled by others, that's obviously not equality. Whereas a male and female could be equal. So there's a variety of things going on. It's not has been unpacked. This though is the sort of classical Western Greek conception of opposites, which we looked at once before. You get limit, unlimited, odd, even, many, one, many, right, left, male, female, resting, moving. Straight curve, light, darkness, good and bad, square, not wrong. So again here, you get this dualism, good and evil, being regarded as the same category as male and female, resting and moving. So again, you've got a mixture of categories here. And because Pythagoras put them all in the same tables, then there's an implication is that anything on the left-hand side is good, and anything on the right-hand side is bad. And that's why you get people thinking, well, if you're left-handed, there's always supposed to be something sinister about it. And sinister itself, just as a Latin for left, but also has sinister implications. And so that's why people are always told you mustn't write with the left hand, it's the devil's hand or something. You have to learn to write with the right hand. You still find these sort of attitudes going around. And you might think, oh, well, what's all that about then? And this is sort of a cultural legacy going all the way back here, a couple of 2,500 years to Pythagoras and the Greeks.
Is it possible also a genetic legacy? I mean, usually in societies when they see some genetic abnormality, whether it's animals or humans, they worry about that being refolded back into the lineage, and so they might have a misconception that left-handedness is also a genetic anomaly.
Yeah, but why would they think it was a genetic anomaly?
Well, because they can't really understand physiology, so we're programmed with a sense that just if something's different, or even genetically diverse, to stay away from it.
Yeah, people with different coloured hair, and different coloured eyes, and
Right, but
The
people
same
persecute red-headed guys, right?
sorry?
People persecute, even today, but redheads get persecuted.
Okay, let's put red hairs, ginger, and bracket in. People have different coloured eyes.
I think Peter's point is that the left-handed people are, and I think probably will always have a minority.
They are a minority, yes, but why would sinister be attributed particularly to that, whereas there are lots of other differences are ignored?
Wasn't blonde also a more rare trait once?
Yeah, but it's, I don't know about that.
The differences are not usually ignored in the beginning, but after some time people get used to them. But so the real question would be, why is left-handedness, why is the aversion to it sustained for so long? Why didn't people get used to it, seeing left-handed people around? Because in the beginning, when you get different races and hair colours, people freak out for a few generations and then just get used to it.
Well, that's right, but you know, that hair
Well,
colour,
it's enduring, isn't it?
the hair colour's not in this list.
Right, yeah. All right, yeah.
And so in that sense, it's a sort of cultural thing that's been passed on through the language. I said even the word sinister, it has these two meanings. It means left and evil.
Yeah.
So it's embedded in the language. So you ask, well, why should it be embedded in the language? Whereas lots of other things don't get these kind of associations. Well, I would say trace it all the way back to Pythagoras. And people seeing this thing here and associating, you know, male with good, female with bad. So again, this is a whole historical legacy which feminism's only just started addressing in the last 100 years. And all these sorts of things.
Just what would be the key?
Yeah, things like straight and bent, you know, that person's a bit bent. Well, that person's very straight, you know what I mean? Again, these sort of things are embedded in our language. I think it comes all the way back from here.
Excuse me, Chris, do you have to keep it down?
Any thoughts on that?
Well, I find square and oblong not too, they're not opposites.
How to explain square and oblong? Well, Pythagoras was basically, he was the geometry. And so he had his reasons for, which I can't honestly remember, for distinguishing square and oblongs. I guess he thought a square was more perfect because he had square numbers, and there's something about square numbers that was better in some sense.
Do you think if you look in other parts of the world, pre-Pythagoras, you'll find left-handedness as being associated in the non-Judeo-Christian or Greek world as being associated with evil?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, anybody comment on that? Well, in Africa, it's the violence. I guess it's probably been influenced a lot by European culture, but
I'm surprised he put 1 and then as opposed to 0 and 1.
okay, you got the 1 and the many. Well, they didn't, 0, they didn't have 0 in those days.
That's brilliant.
No, 0 came from India and brought to Europe by the Arabs.
Pythagoras didn't have 0.
No.
No?
That's why if you look at Roman numbers, you got 1, 1, 2. They don't have 0. It's hard work doing adding and subtracting. How they managed to do all this, these calculations to build these buildings is beyond me. The numbers they had.
Maybe 0 is just a blank space, piece of parchment.
I don't think they had the concept of 0. Or maybe it's just nothing. I don't know.
So his theorem, it was at the time didn't use 0, like how to find the what was it, the area of
Square and the hypotenuse equals the square on the sum of the square on the other two sides. They didn't have zeros, no. Because the Roman numbers were 1, 1, 2, that's all.
He used those.
You don't?
He used the Roman numerals. He didn't use the 0 at all.
Well, no. I mean, the numbers we use are Arabic numbers.
Yeah.
And then it's slightly orientated differently. But then when Islam encountered India, that's where the real maths was done. They found the 0 there.
Oh. I thought the Arabs found it, but it was the Indians.
Yes, they brought it to the west, to Europe, but they encountered themselves in India.
Oh.
And then they integrated into their own number system. And then some of the numbers are turned around a bit, and you've got the Western numbers.
So if they asked the Muslims what they found valuable in India, they would say nothing.
I mean, that's one of the greatness of, was that they saw something good and they adopted it. It's useful. Yeah.
It's interesting because in the West, in the modern world, people would associate unlimited with being something positive and limited with being negative.
Well, I mean, Pythagoras then, he did a lot of his work in the sand, and and so you have the unlimited, it's sort of endless, but then you mark it off, and you impose order, and then you have a triangle or a square or a geometrical shape. And so that makes everything much more orderly.
Right.
Whereas if you're in society, you don't have order, you just have anarchy and social breakdown, no rules and regulations and everything, then it's a bad situation to be living in, a chaotic kind of society with social disintegration. And so his understanding was that order had to be imposed. Of course, the political implications of that, very obvious. The one and the many, so he regarded oneness as being a good thing, and then many was juxtaposed to it. But because it ended up in this, for Pythagoras himself, he didn't necessarily regard, I said this is just a table, and these things became associated. But nowadays, if you think about the world, what kind of thing are people talking about?
Multicultural.
Yes, but in Europe there's been a long standing drive towards unity. Napoleon, Kaiser, Adolf, European Union, trying to have, and difference in that sense has always been regarded as something bad, and that's why you get, this desire for something to be homogenous. Of course, has led to ethnic cleansing. So this idea of pluralism, which some people regard as being good, is a relatively recent idea. A lot of people being interested in unity, which very easily slips off into uniformity. So you think, well, single currency sounds like a great idea, let's do it. 15 years later, the southern states of Europe got 30% unemployment and can't get out of it. So
Is that because of the single currency?
yeah.
See it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Do you want
I
to
don't
go?
know if this is relevant.
Yeah, it is. Yes, because it's led to a huge balance of payments thing. Because Germany's got the same currency as Greece.
Yeah,
In the days gone by, if you wanted to go on a cheap holiday, you go to Greece.
exactly. Yeah.
Since there's a single currency, it's just as expensive going to Greece as it is to Germany. And that's why, that's the reality. And because Germany's got the euro, and the euro, because it's got all these southern European countries in it, which used to have soft currencies, then the euro is quite a weak currency compared to the Deutschmark. So that means the euro is cheaper than the Deutschmark would have been, which means it's very easy for Germany to export, because it's exporting with a weak currency, which also means it undercuts. And so if you've got a choice between a German washing machine and an Italian washing machine, you go for the German, which means
The same quality, but same price.
well, that's right, same price at different quality. Whereas if Germany had its own currency, it would be stronger than the euro. So if you wanted to buy German quality, you'd pay a German price.
Didn't the financial wizards in Germany think about that before they joined the European?
The only financial wizards that thought about this were here.
I see.
And they realised
I understand why they're using the
not a
same
good thing to
currency.
go into. Later on, German economists realised this is not a good thing. But now, once you've done it, and the euro is always a political project, not an economic project. It's always justified on, it's the way to achieve a united Europe. You want to have a United States of Europe, like the United States of America, logically you'd have a single currency. But the only reason why it works in America's only had a single currency for about just over 100 years, relatively recently. And the only reason it works in America because you have a central government which collects money from the rich states and transfers it to the poor states. But in Europe, it doesn't work like that.
They don't transfer money
No,
to the poor states.
no.
You think that's what America does, transferring money from the rich states to the poor states? That what they do?
Well, yes, that's right. It's the same in Britain. We have a single currency, the pound. Most of the money is generated here in London. Vast amounts of money are transferred to the north of England, where the whole industry collapsed. So, and people don't mind because we're all living in the same country. So they don't mind, all these sort of transfers. And people don't like subsidising people for a different country.
Why do things have to be the same price just because it's the same unit? I mean, if the Greek washing machine is rubbish, why not just have the same euros but just different prices?
Well, just the way it works. I mean, they don't make washing machines in Greece.
I don't think they make any.
Well, they do olives and things, but that's why it was always a very cheap place to go to in the past for holidays, as was Spain. You know, Spain is now as expensive as anywhere else. And so, yeah, I don't know what it is here and all that, because it's, you know, huge numbers of people, young people especially, who are unable to find work.
Maybe they're having too many siestas.
Sorry?
No, it's just a joke. It's a bad joke.
It's alright. Yes,
That's nice.
Well, then in the summer, they're necessary.
I mean that's the thing. In Greece, they did. They didn't work as hard. It's too hot, so you have siestas. But then they realised they had their way of life was lower in terms of standard living was much lower. Then tourists would go there. But then as soon as they got the euro, and then people wouldn't lend money to Greece. If the Greeks wanted to borrow money from other people, they'd have to pay more interest than Germans would, because it's a softer currency. They had higher interest rates for Germany, for Greece than you would for Germany. But then when you had a single currency, there's a single interest rate, which meant that Greece was able to borrow money at a much lower interest rate than it could have done in the past.
It couldn't pay it back.
And then it couldn't pay back. And then people lent money to Greece, assuming, well, it's part of the euro, so it's going to be backed up by the European Central Bank, so we don't need to worry. Whereas the people would, the reason why Greek interest rates on the drachma was much higher, because there's a recognition in the past Greece had defaulted. You know, every few decades, the whole thing collapses. So people were factoring in this risk and charging higher interest rates, which meant the Greeks wouldn't borrow unless they needed to borrow, because they'd have to pay higher interest rates. When they got the euro, they got low interest rates, stable currency. For the first few years, it looked like heaven, but eventually, we ended up with these huge debts.
Chris. Oh, there's a guy there. Not you. Okay.
Well,
Okay, so
Yeah.
the window things.
you can see that there's this. There's sort of political project. Okay, so you can see that. Then the principal view of relationship between yin and yang, as you saw, it's just a modification of the substance. So you have curve. Okay, all this is.
William, if that's true,
What?
then, well, what you just said, then, is there really any significant difference between a man and a woman? I mean, the external form has a certain shape, but as far as the internal nature goes,
Well, the internal. Well, what do you think?
I think that when
You say what you think, and then we'll listen to me.
oh, sorry, I thought you said I thought that's me.
Well, I did, and then I said, well, get the other side of it.
Okay, I think that when the divine principle says that a man's feminine side is latent doesn't mean less, it means not yet developed. So that when a man marries a woman, it draws out his latent feminine side, but eventually he becomes equally male and female, just like God is. Although in our church they say you only become whole when you're attached to a female, but I think that attachment is for the purpose of drawing out, teasing out your female side, and vice versa with women, so that eventually you become fully male and female. There is no lopsided nature to that, and you stay as a discrete projection of God, just an individual being, but you become fully male and female.
I wouldn't say fully, but anyway.
Well,
I
so
don't know. I mean, I know that's the theory, but I don't know that's what.
You mean the two opposite poles cancel each other and
not
so
cancel but complement each other.
complement? Yeah.
Constantly. So, for example, we describe God as being male and female, equality. But we said that even though we reflect God's image, we rely on being fused with another being in order to be a complete picture. I don't believe that.
Well, that's fine. But I think, an empirical study would show there are differences between men and women on the inside. And, loads of books about this. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and when people get married, it's like, encountering a completely different way of thinking,
But you can find the same between Oriental and Western.
Yes, can. Well, I was just saying, within the Orient, men and women also similar kind of.
Yeah.
What do you think, Naomi?
I mean, because God has a male aspect and a female, so I'm sure in every single man and every single woman is both opposite can find a bit, not fully, because it would be very weird if it's fully.
I think in my opinion, two men have expressed the difference between male and female in a very special way, which I happen to agree with. Our true father once said, if you look at the rifle, the front half of the rifle represents the man, the second half of the rifle represents the woman. He said, God puts them together and can shoot bullets of true love. And then the man who expressed it very well is like the great American statesman Benjamin Franklin, who said that a man and a woman are like the two halves of a pair of scissors. Can you imagine putting a pair of scissors apart, But it's only when you put them together and put a screw in the middle that they can work anyway, And I think that, but that doesn't make them the same. They're different. They're different in that sense, really.
I think they're different. I mean, the conversations I have with friends who are men are qualitatively different than the conversations I have with friends that are women. And I think the conversations that women have with each other are also different than the conversations they would have with men. In which case I would say, there is something different. It's always going to be different. And I think most psychologists and people, they recognise empirically there is a difference. I'm not a psychologist. I can't give you reams of data and evidence and references, but.
So it's our sexuality that informs our what we say, how we think.
I mean,
that's in a nutshell.
I mean, I think the physiology is different. And for example, one very simple example is that men find it much easier to drive at night than women. Because when you're driving, the thing that's annoying at night is the car's coming towards you with their bright headlights. Now men can you realise there's a car coming towards you with bright headlights, but you just sort of bracket it out. You just look straight ahead and it's there, but it doesn't bother you. Whereas for women, it bothers them. So that's because physiologically, men are able to have more of a sort of tunnel vision and they can bracket that out. Whereas for women, the information coming into their eyes is about the same strength from everywhere. And so that's why they can't bracket out these bright lights coming towards them, which is why they find driving at night more difficult. I mean, a very simple example, I remember when I was growing up as a child, my parents would go to a party and they'd come back and they'd talk about it. And my mother would ask my dad, what do you think? And he said, well, I was talking to so-and-so. And that was the extent of his report about the party. Whereas my mother said, well, I was talking to so-and-so, but at the same time, I noticed that so-and-so and so-and-so were talking to each other, and so-and-so and so, and did you notice her dress and her shoes? So at the same time as my mother was having a conversation with this person, she was able to observe. So even though her eyes were this way, she could actually be looking at what was going on over here. As a man, you're sort of aware of it. You can't focus upon what's over there without looking over there. Whereas of women, apparently...
In that periphery vision?
Well, we have peripheral vision.
Peripheral, sorry.
But this is what I understand physiologically. Women, they can look in one direction, the eyes can go in one direction, but they can actually concentrate and focusing and noticing in a huge amount of detail what is over here at the same time as they're carrying on the conversation. So they have, it's a different kind, physiologically it's a different kind of vision. And
Why
so,
the man can't do that?
why can't they?
Yeah.
It's not a question of why.
Why can't men do it?
So that's the same.
Why can't we
Why can't
see
we?
like that?
It's just, I mean, it's not a question of why, it's a question of this is just physiologically, this is the way it is.
There is a reason why.
Well, I know there's a reason, but you can come up with a reason, but anyway, the reality is this is why it is. But then, okay, if that's the physiology, then you have to think, well, does that affect, one's place in the world and all these sorts of things? And, physiologically is a difference. So does that affect the inner world and make the inner world different as well?
Can the spirit be male or female before the body is
Sorry?
distinctly male or female?
Do you think so? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the relationship between the spirit and the body is in that sense. Whether it's the body that determines the inner aspect.
But you yourself are saying that the male and female aspects are secondary and they're malleable, right? So surely the objective of life is to become experiencing all aspects, and so you become flexible, so that eventually you can move between one and the other. Like in Shakespeare's Henry V, when he talks about when Henry tries to rally his troops, he talks about Englishmen in two different ways. He says when they're at home they're like this, they're calm and peaceful, but when they're at war they're like this, and he's talking about exactly that. The same being that has totally different natures. So I'm saying that God is the same. We talk about God's Holy Spirit as being comforting and feminine side, and then he suddenly is on Mount Zion, like dishing out the judgment. And it's the same being, though.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I don't know if it's empirically true. That's all. I understand what you're saying in theory, but the question is, if you go and read lots of books about masculinity, femininity, and gender, and all these things, I think most women, this whole feminist thing was we're not men. There is a difference.
Yeah, of course, we're locked into our physiology for a while, but according to what you said here, it's not an absolute. It is a relative.
Well, it's a modification.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have a straight piece of metal, and you can put, you can press something into it, and so you've got concave and convex, and you can go and hammer it out again.
But as we know, as men get older, their estrogen increases and testosterone decreases, and they become more emotional and become more sensitive, like women, and vice versa. So even in a few short decades of life, you see a swing.
Well, there's a change. The question is whether, you were saying in theory, it ought to be completely...
Right, but as long as the man is locked into a male physiology, it's always going to be on one side, right?
Well, that's right.
And then, but when we pass on and go to the next world, I think things will be more flexible.
Well, again, I don't know that the people who've talked about the next world have said that. I understand what you're saying in theory, but there's no evidence for it, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, that's all. I mean, it's theory, but, does one have evidence to support it? Anyway, there we are. Okay, so here we have this thing then, you've got this sort of Sung Sang, Hyung Sang, upper and lower, subject and object, and you've got Yin and Yang modifications. And so you've got the physical body, more masculine or more feminine, and the mind can also be more masculine or more feminine. I mean, you do get these problems. I just watched, my daughter showed me a little YouTube thing. It was really surprising, of a child. And then one of the first, let's think, how was it now? That's right, this couple had a daughter. And then when his daughter was, I think, about 3, one of the first things started saying, I'm a boy. And always wanted to dress like a boy, do everything. And eventually, and then that was interesting, she articulated it as, I am a male soul or spirit trapped inside a female body. And so
The child said that?
Sorry?
The child said it like that?
No. She said, I'm a boy.
Yeah.
And she wanted to dress like a boy, behave like a boy, be with boys. Her whole character was, and she identified herself as a boy. She wasn't interested in dolls or anything. So it wasn't something imposed, it wasn't something to develop late, it was something to develop when this person's about 3 years old. And I thought, well, that's interesting. How would one go about explaining that? Because obviously not. I mean,
Well, that could be explained. She could be called a tomboy if she's doing things that boys like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she'll grow up to, want something drastic like gender.
well, she did. I mean, I showed you.
Oh, did she did?
Well, I traced the particular thing up to about 13 or 14, and that was the plan. Because, statistics are like nearly half the people who have this kind of condition try to commit suicide. And and so parents didn't want that, and so they, instead of trying to contradict her, like making a left hand or right with the right hand, they supported her in that sense of
But
identity.
left and right hand, this is such a problem, I don't think. But having a problem with your gender.
Well, I agree. I mean, I agree. It's a huge, you know.
And actually, this one of my theories that I've seemed to come up with. Sometimes I see men and I see the women in them. You know, you can see, like, for instance, they look like their mother. And perhaps, William, you look like your mother. You know, some women, they look like their father because they take off. So really, there isn't, you know, there isn't that much difference between. You know, it's the X and Y chromosome.
Well, that's right. But then you get some people like that who, on the inside, they identify themselves as different to what their body tells them they ought to do. I can imagine it must be a dreadful situation to find oneself in.
Surely that's a form of mental. It's a mental problem.
Well, you can classify it as that, but the point is it exists, and you know how to deal with it.
I mean, the fact that they opt for surgery for themselves shows that they have convictions. So
Well, yes.
that shows something, right? It's not a whim, otherwise they
No,
wouldn't
it was
do
something I said from emerged when she was about 3 years old. I mean, it's, you know, they just showed pictures and her saying things up until I think she was about 13, 14. Yeah, I've never seen anything before that, like that before. But
You've heard of eating disorders where some people, you know, our appetites point us towards foods that is actually compatible. Some people have eating disorders where they're not interested in food, they want to eat just wood or just stone. And that, you know, it's possible that your alignment can be just completely thrown off and you're completely convinced that that's what you need.
yeah, and the question is, you know, why is it like this sometimes?
What I don't really get is, I don't know if this is not politically correct to say, but like, I'm not in their shoes, but couldn't they learn to accept the way they are? I mean, like, they feel like a woman in a man's body, but then they could accept that. Rather than getting surgery to become something that they feel that they are, but they're not. It's like if you're really ugly, you know, you don't accept that you're ugly, so you get surgery. Because you feel like you're worth.
But that's different because there's physical evidence that one might be ugly, but to think that you might be the wrong gender when you're not in the mirror, that's a mental problem.
Yes.
I mean, it's hugely problematic.
Yes.
I'm just glad I wasn't like that.
Yeah.
And I can imagine it must be dreadful to be like that and to have to deal with that and how to cope with it and how to.
Perhaps, you know, something like hypnotherapy with
I don't know.
hypnosis. Sorry.
Was that?
Hypnosis.
I have no idea. I'm just saying, you know, that's the way you feel about yourself. It must be a terrible situation to find oneself in.
Yes.
How to deal with it, what to do, whether to try and find a cure, this or that or the other. It's just an awful kind of reality.
I think one of the misunderstandings is that we think we make more choices than we actually do. People who like music or people who like maths or all those kind of things, they're pretty much determined by our DNA. And our physiology, you know, our physiology guides us towards liking this kind of food, not that kind of food, and having this kind of emotions or this kind of mood. And so we don't have as much choice as we think we do. Later on in life, we can adjust it. So if somebody's physiology is sending them errant messages about what they like or what they feel like, you can't just switch that off. And to go against it must be complete torture for them.
Well, yeah, lots of people, you know, have allergies and they just have to say, okay, that's the way it is, so I'm going to avoid drinking milk or something. You just have to adjust things. So that sort of thing, you can't choose to have a lactose intolerant. That's the way it is. Whereas there's some things you can choose. So there's some things, you know, are determined, some things you can, one has a huge amount of choice.
Well, the fact that I'm a man and attracted to women, if I try to imagine going against that and switching that off and being attracted to men instead, it's pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
So it must be the same almost impossibility for homosexuals.
Well,
My biology is telling me
Okay.
feel that attraction towards women, not
I mean,
men.
I think it's probably a lot more complicated why people become homosexual. I don't think you can say to one particular thing.
Well,
I
of
think
course.
probably, and so in that sense, it's not necessarily determined. I would say quite a bit of a mixture of things.
Mm.
Depends on the person, really. I mean, a lot of these things people don't know yet why. Okay, anyway, so that's the understanding that there's something, the universal image of God is inner, outer, positive and negative, yin and yang. But also, when you look at the world in which we live, there's also lots of individual images. So the idea is that within God there's an infinite number of individual images within God's inner human self, which we looked at last week. And so this is the idea then, so I'll come to another point in a minute. Anyway, this idea then, within God, there's all these individual images. In that sense, this is the cause of the uniqueness in every single human being. So this is the sort of theological explanation for the uniqueness in every individual human being, is that every individual is an expression of this, or in individual image. Yeah, the other is, well, that particular sperm and that particular egg happened to meet, and that's what came along. If it would be a different sperm and a different egg, it would be a different person. But theologically, it's this kind of idea. This is the cause of the uniqueness of every human being. And then from that comes the idea, not just the uniqueness of every human being, but then the individual value of every human being. So if every human being then is a unique expression of God, then that means every individual human being has divine value and has, should be respected as such. And you get that whole idea, biblical idea, which in the modern world is translated into the idea of human rights. So, this idea, going back to the Bible, God is personally interested in every single individual, goes to the idea of individual rights and human rights, which just emerged in the last few centuries.
What does the phrase mean in the second point? Manifestation of one of God's individual images.
Well, because there's an infinite number of individual images within the mind of God.
Back to that word infinity again.
Well, effectively, yes. I mean, basically, it's running. It's a number which runs up towards infinity.
Like snowflakes.
Sorry.
Well, they say there's not two snowflakes that are the exact same design.
Yeah, I think it's probably even greater. If you think of every single individual sperm and every single individual egg and all the different possible permutations, you're running towards infinity. And the fact is, most of these permutations will never happen because people usually don't have more than a couple of children. But actually, there was probably 100 million or a billion possible combinations of the sperm that a man has and the number of eggs that a woman has.
But all snowflakes are they based on the same mathematical one principle?
Yeah.
So there doesn't need to be something corresponding to a snowflake that has that same image. It's just that each one expresses that mathematical principle in the same way.
But in a different way.
Yeah, sorry, in a different way. So could it be that God has the logos of God, which is fundamental principle that describes makeup, and each human being is an expression of that, rather than this idea that God himself has an infinite number of images that pre-exist?
Well, I said the different ways of thinking about it, which we'll come to in a minute. Okay, so again, this is the idea that God cares about every single individual person. And it's also the basis then for having a relationship with God. Because, God is able to know us because we are an expression of God. Not an abstract, universal expression, but a particular, unique expression. And so we're relating to God. God finds himself within us in that way. So in this unique joy that every single person can give. So that was the sort of divine image, and then you got the sort of the original character, the divine character. So normally when religions talk about what's God's character, talk about God is omniscient, God is all-knowing, God is all-powerful, God is righteous, God is good, God is love. Okay, these are like attributes of God. Now, this is a sentence that says in Unification Thought, so Unification Thought proposes heart, logos and creativity instead of examining these other attributes, omniscience, etc., unification thought proposes hard logos and creativity, which are directly related to the solution of actual problems as constituting the divine character. So what do you think about that sentence?
It's like,
I don't really understand it.
Unification thought proposes three things: heart, logos, and creativity as the divine character. And the reason it proposes heart, logos, and creativity as the divine character is because these particular trio are directly related to the solution of actual problems.
Does logos correspond to intellect and creativity to will?
Emotion, intellect, and will, yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
But that's not the point.
Yeah.
it's like applied science.
Okay.
Whereas applied science is you get the funding for the research because you have the use for it.
Uh-huh.
So you've got the effort in already intending to do something with it.
Right.
This is the perspective of God.
Right. It's very that's very quite utilitarian, isn't it? So it's not pursuing truth for its own sake,
Yeah.
but pursuing something because it's useful to do that, more like technology. So this sentence then reveals the nature of unification thought. It's not interested in truth for its own sake, but it describes God in this way because to describe God in this way is useful because it enables us to solve the problems in the world. You understand? So what's going on here then? So when you read this chapter, you find most of the examples in the chapter come from human beings. To understand what God is like, we should look at a human being as like this. To understand this, we need to. So what's going on here?
What is logos?
Logos just, I'll come on to logos.
Oh, okay.
It just means reason, law,
Oh,
word.
yeah.
So in that sense, it's saying God is like this because if we think of God like that, it's helpful to do something over here. You know what I mean? What do you think of that as an approach?
It's objective.
Sorry? Well, it is. It's saying God may not be like this, but we're going to say God is like this because it helps us to do that.
Well,
It
every
really depends on the.
Sorry?
It really depends on the use. In what way that approach is used.
I mean, every country that worshipped God with a small g did the same thing, didn't it?
Hmm?
Every country that worshipped gods with a small g did the same thing.
Well, that's right, but that was what the Bible said you shouldn't do.
Yeah.
You shall not make any images.
Yeah.
Because God is beyond concepts, God is beyond words, God is beyond images. All you can say about all the ideas you have about God is they're all wrong. Because they're all partial, relative, finite, temporal.
Yeah, I don't like that.
You don't like what?
Well, I mean, I can say with certainty that God is a benevolent God. That's not wrong. It's not a complete image of God, but nor is it wrong. I can say that God is a God who's creative, or God is a God who likes to nurture his children and see them grow so that he can relate to them. I might not have empirical proof, and that's also not a complete picture of God, but nor is it completely wrong.
Right, so none of these things are complete pictures of God, they're all partial.
But that doesn't make them wrong, though.
Well, it makes them wrong in the sense they're always incomplete, and that in itself means they are wrong, they're incomplete.
But they're only wrong if they claim to be statements of completeness, but I don't think we should equate incompleteness with wrong.
No, but here it's trying to, I find it's interesting here that proposes these three, this trinity of the divine character for a very utilitarian kind of purpose, as opposed to, well, actually this is what God is really like, irrespective of whether this understanding of God is helpful to solve our problems of our world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in that sense it's saying, well, we're going to limit God to being like that because it's useful, as opposed to... So that's it, you know what I mean? So that's the way it is over and over again. So I find it problematic. I think the rest of it's a lot better because it's more empirical, trying to describe the way the world is. But it's presenting itself as this is the way that God is, therefore this is the way the world is. But actually it's kind of...
William, I sometimes feel that you conflate the logos with the expression. The expression can be infinite, but the logos could be, technically, it could be quite simple. Like the Mandelbrot set, mathematical equations, technically, it's not like it's not like an infinite number of equations. It's relatively simple, but there's infinite expressions. So can't God be the same if God is the original template? Couldn't God on his fundamental, most level, reduced level, be quite simple?
I'm not saying that, I'm just saying the way in which unification thought makes that choice is for utilitarian purpose. I'm not saying this is the way God actually is,
Yeah.
but actually it's useful for us to say God is like this. And that's what I find interesting.
I guess, I mean, I haven't read it, but it depends to what extent they, project an image on the way God is
Right.
for
What
that
exactly?
purpose.
So to what extent is this correct? Yes. And what extent is this projecting something onto God as opposed to trying to find out what God is? And people generally try to find out what God is just in itself. Usually come to the conclusion eventually it's all a big mystery. It's beyond human description, it's beyond everything which I can possibly imagine. So the unification thought tries to tame God, I would say. Put God in a box, make God compartmentalized. And that aspect of it I don't like at all.
Hasn't the history of religion been human beings experimenting and mapping out, building up a map of what God is like? And you yourself said that the reason why some scriptures endure and others fall away is because people put them into practice and they find enrichment and use from them, and that's like it itself is a kind of verification process. And especially Judaism and Christianity have been like a really hyper-focused version of that. And so the wisdom that we have now, after all these thousands of years, is in a way, not perfectly verified, but somewhat verified mapping of what God is and isn't like.
Well, anyway, that's not what's going on here. This is a very rationalistic attempt to describe what God is like based upon reason. Whereas if you look at the Bible, you look at the scriptures, it's all really very, very messy.
Yeah.
Here it's trying to tidy it all up.
That's kind of like what science is trying to do with the four forces, right? The desperate to unify them.
Well, yes, it's tidy up. I guess so. It's tidying it up. Anyway, it was just an interesting sentence I came across, which I think, which is nice of him to put it in, because then he just gives the game away. That's what he's doing.
Repropose.
I mean, I think the insights are brilliant, but, it's just worth bearing in mind that's what he was doing. And, I don't know that's a particularly legitimate way to proceed in these sort of matters. Because it's trying to make it all very tidy. Whereas a genuine religious experience tends to talk about, it's awesome, the mystery, etc., which is beyond categories. You can't actually come up with a description. And so that's why it's all metaphors. Whereas unification thought tries to get away from metaphors, to say actually we can describe what God is like, and God is this. You know what I'm saying? That makes sense. There's no recognition here of religious language being metaphorical. There's no recognition of unification thought that it's just a bunch of metaphors and symbols and signs, which has no, which is just touching the surface of reality. Okay, so we talked about different problems with different languages, impossibility of translation and everything, but the author of Unification Thought seems to be completely unaware of this. Yeah.
Well, maybe it's not a translation problem, it's just that's exactly how Reverend
Well, this is not, Reverend didn't write this. It's written by someone called San Li. He was one of his disciples. Obviously, he came up with it as a result of discussion with Sun Moon, yes. But he was the actual author. So he built, some of you talked about certain insights, and Sanhangli elaborated on these things and expanded them, partly through discussing with some of you, but also just going around thinking about it, reading about it, trying to come up with something, which I think is full of lots of insights, but also
I think I know what you're saying now. It's just too
tidy, isn't it?
yeah. It's saying that the religion is the solution to everybody's problem.
Yes, and I think it's just much more complicated than it is. Yeah, and anyway, that's what I think.
So Reverend Moon, he didn't write the DP. It was his associate that wrote it down.
Yes, he didn't actually write these books. He gave
He gave lectures and somebody wrote them down.
he gave lots of talks, and he did write an original version which was never published. It's a sort of very much a stream of consciousness kind of book. And then he would talk and talk and talk, and he would explain things. And then he had as you said, his disciples were incredibly intelligent, and they were able to systematize it. And so they were the ones who systematized it into these books called the Divine Principle. He himself would never talk in that kind of structured way. He himself, you read his speeches, they're very rich with all kinds of stuff going on all over the place. So this is based upon his insights, but he didn't write it. Somebody else put it together in that sense, put the pieces together, systematized it. With discussion, of course.
It's a bit ironic. Taking a stream of consciousness, sometimes hillbilly, but full of deep insights, and systematizing it, and then again, at least stating that they're trying to systematize the core aspects of God. At least I think it's important to know their approach, and then at least then you can take it with a bit of salt in the way they.
Yeah. This religious language, we talked about it quite often, about different languages, being social constructs, ways that people perceive the world. If you think in one language, you see the world and human relationships in one way. If you're thinking in a different language, you see the world and human relationships are structured differently. I think this is a very core point, which goes back to this, every image, every idea you have of God is always going to be socially constructed using the language in which you're thinking. So it's always going to be partial, it's always going to be wrong, it's always going to be this, that, and the other. Okay, but Samye Moon himself thinks that Korean as a language is something kind of unique and absolute, and everyone should learn it, and the whole world should speak it. So his way of solving this problem is to make Korean the single language of the world. Then you don't have the problem. You know what I mean? You only realize that language is a problem when you encounter someone with a different language, or when you try to translate something and you realize it's impossible to have an exact translation, or if you're brought up bilingually, you're aware, that the world is different depending on what you're thinking in. But if you're monolingual and the whole world is monolingual, this doesn't become an issue, and you assume that your language corresponds exactly to reality. You know what I mean?
But isn't that dangerous? Monolingual.
Yes, I would agree with you.
I mean, English could become the dominating language of the next century, but is that a good thing?
Well, I think there's a difference between a common language. I think it's helpful to have a common language, but not to have a single language. I think of English as a common language, which enable people from different places to be able to speak to each other without having to learn hundreds of languages. Having a common language, I think, is helpful, yes, but having a single language is not.
It's harder to learn other people's language than it is to just, a French and a German just speak English.
To each other, yes. It's much easier.
But then again, there aren't that many differences between European languages. There's slight differences.
There are enough.
But it's also more respectful. If I go to Japan and I go speak English instead of speaking in Japanese, it's less respectful.
Well, that's because English. If you're English, then it's a problematic situation. But for a German and a French person to speak English is like a neutral language. So it means a German can speak to a French person, or a German can speak to a Spanish person, or an Italian, or a Greek, or a Russian. But just by learning English, you can speak to people from many different countries who've also learned English. So in that sense, it's quite useful as having that kind of common language.
But they wouldn't feel bad that they're speaking the language of the conquerors.
Well, let's just put that in a bracket. I mean, it's just very utilitarian. It's just useful. That's all. You know, you just forget about how it came to be like that. But it's just a useful thing to have a common language, a lingua franca. I mean, in the past, it used to be French. Throughout Europe, you know, the educated people spoke French to each other. Or before then, Latin to each other. So they'd have the vernacular, what they would use when they were at home. If they went abroad, they could travel and meet anybody from the same social educated class, and they could all speak Latin to each other. So in that sense, it's just something. It's just useful.
I think the thinking on this problem is too linear. I mean, we think in terms of we have a human experience, and that limits us in our ability to understand God. That's a very linear thinking. But I think in terms of God saw to it that the universe would be a certain way and that the planets would be a certain way and that we would have this limited experience and it would shape our thinking and our human relationships, because ultimately God's reason for creation was to create beings that could be like Him and understand Him so you could have a relationship. So actually, it's alright. I mean, the reason why we're like this is because the God that we want to try to understand saw to it that we would be like this so that we would understand Him. So our projecting our experience onto what God is like could be actually God's way of helping us to understand Him. Whereas, as it says in the Pythagoras, if everything was just infinite, if there was no limited human experience, we wouldn't understand anything. And so I feel like it's a plus, not a negative, as far as helping us to understand God's nature.
What is the plus?
Well, we understand ourselves.
Yeah,
And then we project that onto God, because God Himself saw to it that we would be like this.
Well, yes, but you know, that's what we do. But then it's very easy to fall into the temptation of that's the way God really is.
No, but I'm proposing the idea that perhaps God Himself is the one that saw to it that we would have this limited experience, so that we could be an expression of that's the way He is. Not so much the errant fallen nature side.
Yeah, I mean, if you think God designed us, I guess.
Well, simple things like when we grow up, we have a desire to have children so we can nurture them and get joy from seeing them flourish. So we can project that onto God and say that God is a being who likes to bring into being other beings and nurture them so that His joy comes from them flourishing. So isn't that projecting?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. Yeah, I'm saying that's what we do.
Yeah.
But why do we have children? Well, that's all part of that's just biology.
That's what I'm
That's all
saying.
part of the evolutionary process. If we didn't have children, the human species would have become extinct a long time ago.
Yeah, so I'm saying God saw to it that would be the case.
Well, you could say God saw to it that would be the case, or one could say, well, that's just the way things have developed.
Well,
I mean, I tend to go with the second.
so you don't think God intentionally created human beings?
No.
Really?
No.
Okay. So
No,
you
I
think?
said that a long time ago.
Well, I've never heard that directly. So you think God just created the universe, or saw to it that the universe came into being?
I think God created the universe on the hope that beings will emerge with which you'll be able to have, you know, a very close relationship.
So it could have been a
Friendship.
50-50. You might
Could
never
have,
have.
could have been a fish. It didn't have to be a human being.
Well, it doesn't matter to me what our form is. Right? It doesn't matter what our form is, but the fish were about to develop intelligence.
So that's what I'm saying. Well, when I say human being, I mean, you know, it could have been a dolphin, it could have been a whale, it could have been, you know, all I'm saying is I think at some point things are such that things get more and more complex to you get to the point of being able to have a relationship with the divine.
Yeah, we could have had 6 fingers or 4 fingers, but the point is that we're complex enough to have a relationship, right? But what I'm saying is you don't think that God pretty much knew that would eventually be one of the outcomes.
Well, yes, because when you consider the size of the universe, it's basically pretty much inevitable that somewhere or other there'll be a planet where it's possible for life to emerge and where this, and this.
Yeah.
And so it's possible. There are lots of other planets which are in a similar situation. I mean,
But I'm saying, couldn't it be God's design that the way they live causes them to experience a life and a growth of mental state that He wishes so that they can understand Him? And by them projecting that onto Him, that's what He wanted. That's His method of teaching them what He's like.
I don't understand, but that's what you think He wanted. So I'm
No,
saying
it's hypothesis.
you're projecting that and you're projecting the projection of that. And all I'm saying is I'm agnostic about all that. I don't know. It's possibly true, but
you don't make agnostic statements, you make absolute statements that we cannot know.
what? Cannot know what?
Well, you say it's impossible to know God. That's not an agnostic statement. That's an
I say it's
atheist.
impossible to know God.
Well, when you say
It might be impossible.
we project, you don't say might. You say when you say we project our nature onto God.
Well, that's what you were saying we do, and I agree that's what we do.
Yeah. But you're saying by doing that.
And I think we're assuming God is like that, and I'm saying, well, I don't think that's necessarily the way God is. Maybe, but
It might be.
It might be, but the evidence, in my opinion, looking at religious experience, is that God probably isn't like that.
Isn't a being who likes to nurture other beings and take joy in their flourishing?
Well, yes, but there's lots of other stuff going on as well. You get the angry God, you get the thunderbolts, you get people getting wiped out, you get all this other stuff. So, okay.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes people say God is benevolent and loving and etc. because that's the way we would like Him to be. But the historical record that people have had encounters with God, Moses, saying God wanted to wipe the people out because He's got fed up to the back teeth with them. I mean, that's what I'm saying is, when you read all these accounts, it's not, God isn't just a loving, benevolent being, but God has a whole range of stuff going on there, which you can't just put in a box.
Yeah, I mean, God made volcanoes and fierce lions as
And I
well.
don't know if He made them, these are just things that emerge.
You know what I mean when I'm saying that. I don't want to sound too much like Magic Farage, but you know what I mean.
Do you think we could make some maybe small indent into heart logos?
Yeah, let's move on with it. So, alright. Okay, so here, again, it's just a diagram which is totally misleading because God is one, it's just complete oneness. But if one were to try and do it like this, the heart is the core, the essence of God, it's not helpful having someone saying it in the same way that either. Okay, so this is the definition of heart and the Unification Thought. It's basically a phenomenological definition, in other words, a description. Heart is the emotional impulse to seek joy through love. And so again, this is a projection from what a human being is. We want to experience joy, and the deepest joy that we experience is the joy we get through giving and receiving love. At the end of the day, knowledge, power, money, all these things, nothing, the old romance, the songs are like this, the poetry's like this. At the end of the day, it's love. And it's incredible joy and sense of deep joy that one gets from a relationship with love, from giving and receiving love. So that's the understanding of heart, this impulse, this desire, irrepressible desire to give and receive love, and the joy that goes along with that. And then you've got these three different understandings of heart. So if you say that this is the core of God, this provides a motivation for why God would create the universe. Sometimes people ask different people, why did God create the universe? Well, He was experimenting, or He was having fun, so the Unification Thought says, well, the reason why, the motivation for God creating the universe and for creating human beings was God's desire to experience joy through love. And that's why there are beings which are like God, because He can have the deepest relationship with beings that are like Himself. And that was the motivation behind it. It wasn't an experiment, it wasn't that He was bored, it wasn't wanted something to do. It was that core, that nature of God's motivation, which is quite interesting. So that is, often one of the things that people struggle to explain. If God exists, why did God create human beings? Why did God create the universe? So I think this gives the best explanation for me. And then you have here the heart of the fall, so the idea that, well, God created human beings, Adam and Eve were his children. Because of the fall, then, you know, God's heart was broken. So even though God is love, and God is almighty, God is all-powerful, God can actually be broken-hearted. God grieves. So again, it's a whole theme through the Bible, God grieves. And sometimes people say, well, you know, where was God, you know, Auschwitz, or where all these terrible things are happening? Is God just sitting up there on his throne? So this understanding, biblical understanding, say that God is actually there. God is suffering with every single child who's suffering. God is suffering and feeling that child or that person pain and agony as his own. So in that sense, God is a God of grief. But not only is that, but God also loves each person and so he wants every human being to be happy. So this idea of the heart of restoration, God has been working to try to make the world a better place. And so it's the whole impetus behind the religion, trying to teach people the right way of life, trying to stop wars and injustice and promote justice and equality and all these sorts of things. Because God wants to restore the world to make it the way he originally wanted. And the way he does that is to people respond to him. Yeah. So that's the nature of God's heart. The understanding God's love is absolutely unique, eternal and unchanging. So that's this idea of heart. And the second character is logos. So logos is a Greek word, and its most famous use is in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. So that's translated from the Greek. In the beginning was the logos. In the beginning was the Word is with God. The Word was God. So here you have this understanding that God is a God of heart and love, but also from the beginning of the Gospel of John, God is a being of logos. And so this, the principle of unification thought is understanding the union of reason and law, or freedom and necessity. And so reason then, with your reason you can imagine all kinds of things. You know, with your reason and your imagination you can draw all kinds of shapes of aeroplanes on a piece of paper. But when it comes to actually making a plane that's going to fly, what are the limitations? Gravity, engineering, yes? So you have to tailor your reason and your imagination so it's within the law of aerodynamics and your plane will fly. So reason then is connected to freedom, law is connected to necessity. You can't escape the laws of gravity. And then also the idea of, so here things are not determined mechanically, but there's always this aspect of freedom that goes along with it. And so this idea here is then that God had a design, a blueprint for everything in the universe, and then that became the basis for God creating things. So unification thought, as presented, honestly speaking, goes along a lot in this particular section with what we would call intelligent design, which I personally think is not philosophically coherent. And this becomes more, when we look at human beings, you'll see how that works. And then you've got God as being in creativity, so again it's a key attribute in all traditions. God created the universe, and so God's creativity is compelled by heart and guided by love. So God created, the reason why God created was that to experience joy through love, but in order to do that, it had to be a universe that was going to work. For the universe to work, you had all this incredible fine-tuning at the beginning of the Big Bang. Everything had to be exactly, all the numbers had to stack up to be exactly what they are. Otherwise there would be no universe in which there's complexity and consciousness. So God wanted to create a universe in which beings would emerge, with which you could have a relationship. In order to do that, you had to work within the law. So here you have this understanding then that God himself is limited by logos or by law. Now, God cannot create a square circle. And so, and so this then summarizes the contents of the original image. We're looking at divine image, Sankhya, sandwich, and visual images, the divine character, heart, logos, and creativity. And the way this cashes out in the biblical tradition is the three blessings of to be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion. So to be fruitful is to become mature, to inherit God's heart, to become one with God, logos is about reason, laws about, in the human laws about ethics, morality. It's about the relationships between human beings. And so that's where you get this idea of the family. And then creativity is about having dominion over the creation. So in that sense, God wanted us to become like Him. And so God gave human beings the three blessings, the ability to perfect to develop our character, to become beings of heart, the ability to multiply our children, through that to experience God's heart, and also the ability to, to create things and then develop God's creativity.
Are you saying there's a correlation between emotion, intellect and will? So emotion corresponds to first blessing and intellect second blessing and will third blessing?
No.
Isn't that what you just said?
Probably.
Heart, logos and creativity?
Well, all these things are, yes, I would say yes and no. At the end of the day, emotion, intellect and will are all one, express different facets of the mind,
Yeah.
and your mind is, you experience as a unity. So if you want to break that unity up and then, put one label here, here and here, you can do that, but it's artificial in that sense, because reality is not like that. Reality is just a unity.
Didn't you just run through that list and go do that though?
Well, yes, because this is what I'm explaining what the book says. I just happen to disagree with it.
Oh, I see. I didn't know you disagree with that part.
Sorry?
I didn't know you disagree with that part.
Well, as I said often, I find it's very problematic when you use diagrams and you use language,
Yeah.
because you're having to, I think reality, what you experience is as a whole, but then, we categorize things and we draw diagrams, but the diagram is only a model. It's not really what reality is like. And if you take the diagram for reality, you end up, getting it wrong, which is often what happens.
Being a two-dimensional world.
Yeah, or even three-dimensional world is still, it divides things up and puts little circles around them, but that's not how we experience things.
Yeah.
It's just a help to try to. A diagram is just to help you to understand, but it's not really the way things are. That's how I see it. Anyways.